As far as alternative global currencies go, and people say, well, that oil's not going to be priced in dollars anymore. I don't know. I mean, there was talk in the 80s of a yen bloc, you remember, and the yen was going to take over and so on. I'm not qualified really to give you an expert opinion. I'm just dubious about that. I think there will be, just as the euro has become, I don't say the dollar will continue in its current form, but I think it will still be at least a global currency. But it's anybody's guess. Do you follow it yourself? Do you have a view on this?
The idea of whenever we have gone to war, our taxes have risen.
Yes.
This is the only war where we have no one seems to grasp, no one seems to power that a lower taxes and imperial adventurism are irreconcilable.
Yes, right. Very well put, very well put. And it's very frustrating to me, because when I was talking earlier about, spending more money on health and education in Asia and more scholarships and all of that, I mean, that's money that would have to come out of the budget, and you can't do that as long as we're in this bind, and so sort of ultimately what I'd like to see depends on, or coming back from lunch, depends on getting substantial reductions in Iraq, if not out altogether, and scaling back in elsewhere. And who knows when that will happen. Get a Middle East person to tell you about that. Yes.
You haven't mentioned Russia as a player in Asia. That's the majority of their land.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm grinning because what I hear from the Southeast Asians, including a former Secretary General of ASEAN, is that since 2005, when these East Asian summit meetings have been held with the 16 countries, Russia has come and said, oh, we're Asian, you want to invite us. And then the summits are over and they turn their back on Asia. This is what I'm told, right? When you look at opinion polls in Russia, even though the territory, vast territory, it's called the Far East, the Russian Far East, far from Moscow. And the orientation in the polls, when you ask Russians, tends to be more, thinking of themselves more towards Europe, east of the Urals. I have had an interesting discussion with a Singaporean who said, if you try to join the East Asian Summit process, this 16-nation group, that means we'll have to invite Russia, because the energy trade with Russia is significant. That's really the main connection with Russia. Russia, of course, is part of the six-party talks, the North Korea talks, and has a stake in not seeing a lot of North Koreans flow over the border if there's some kind of disaster there. But for the most part, they really haven't been credible players in Asia. There was a time, maybe you remember this, when Gorbachev gave a speech in 1985, and he said he wanted Vladivostok to be a window on Asia. And he was trying to catch up with, just as India's Look East policy does the same thing, he was really trying to hook Siberia into the dynamism of East Asia. But it never went anywhere, as far as I can tell, whether it's the incompetence or corruption of the provincial governments or something else. It's a very interesting book by Gilbert Rosman, who's a sociologist at Princeton, and this guy is amazing. He speaks and reads something like 6 languages, including Russian, Chinese, Japanese. I think he's now learning Korean. And like a good sociologist, he's spent time on the ground in that part of the world where Russia connects with Asia. He wrote a book called Northeast Asia's Stunted Regionalism, and it refers to an effort that was made to connect in some sort of federation Western Japan, the Russian Far East, Northeast China, Manchuria, and Korea, I think, or South Korea anyway, into some sort of an economic union. And it has never gotten off the ground, partly because the Russians couldn't deliver their part of it. But it's worth watching. All I can say is they're not real players now, except in energy.
I think the first one is in Korea, that Southerners think of themselves as keystone for Northeast Asia, holding together Japan and China. And I get the view that the deep thinkers in the South foreseeing a unified peninsula company. Now, how does the rest of these things?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was in Southeast Asia, I asked them if they had any concerns about Korea. And I got an interesting answer. They said, we never used to pay attention to Korea, but now there's significant Korean investment, South Korean investment throughout Southeast Asia, and very heavy in India, actually. Yeah. And so there's more interest there. There is, because of this regional integration movement that I've been describing, there's much more contact between the Koreans and Southeast Asia, or between Northeast and Southeast Asia generally. And by the way, we always call China Northeast Asia. In the book, when I look at geography, China is both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. It's on the same latitude as Burma and Thailand in the south. But anyway, I mean, the Koreans are interesting because, and I don't haven't been there recently, but I think they're exaggerating their role if they see themselves as sort of a keystone holding China and Japan together. I mean, they have dreadful record of hostility to the Japanese. You must have seen these tourist signs that, there'll be fairly neutral English description of some wartime monument, and then the Korean will say, this is where these Japanese ogres and monsters slaughtered Korean women and children. I mean, that isn't quite right, but there's a lot of that, and they've been as unwilling to deal with the history issue, I think, as the Japanese have, which is not good. So but they do have this interesting, as I mentioned before, they have seen an opportunity, being located as they are, to not just expand their trade with both China and Japan, but to paint themselves as a kind of bridge, because they've been stepped on essentially by both countries. They play up the. I don't mean, this sounds cynical. I started to say they play up the empathy card. I didn't quite mean that. I mean, they have some historical understanding of what it feels like to be colonized, and that plays well in Southeast Asia, very well. And they also have some claim to being a small country wedged between big countries, and therefore agile diplomats. So there's actually been Korean statements about being a bridge to the rest of Asia and so forth. But I think they exaggerate their role a little bit, but they are quite active. It's interesting. Yes. Are you from Australia? Will you give me your opinion after I give you my opinion? I can't help saying what a wonderful trip I had to Australia. This is neither here nor there, but and don't you answer. Does anybody know what a quokka is? You do. Does anyone know what a quokka is? Quokka. This is really nothing to do with our topic, but I can't help mention this. I did a speaking tour in Australia. It was my first trip there about a year ago, and I started in Perth, which is a beautiful city on the Indian Ocean. And in fact, Western Australia is not only exporting tons of stuff to China, but is developing trade with India. But it's so far away from everything else, most people don't go there. There's an island off the coast of Perth. You get to it by going to Fremantle, the port, and getting on a boat going out to this island. It's called Rottnest, which is derived from a Dutch expression meaning rat's nest, because when they looked at it, they thought it was full of rats. But actually, a quokka, which inhabits this island, is a marsupial. It has a pocket for a baby, but it's about this big, and it has these big hind legs and these little arms, and one of them sort of stood up and started to box with me. They're really very appealing creatures, and I saw them in Perth. But yeah. I love it. Well, that's great. Anyway, to answer your question, Australia has its hand, as far as I know. Australia is part of what's it called, the Five-Power Defense Group with New Zealand and Great Britain and Singapore and Indonesia, I think. Anyway, they have a cooperative military role there, but I don't know that amounts to too much. What they do undertake is a very significant security role in the South Pacific. There are lots of these. We don't even pay attention to this, but there are lots of small islands, some of which have serious domestic political problems, and there's been Australian forces deployed to these things. And the big one you just mentioned was